Good evening, friends. You are most welcome to Civil Affairs channel. Today we are going to discuss social anthropology by Maan IGNOU. Here we will discuss gender and society mane004, and our main topic is women's movement in India. Contents are introduction part, position of women in India, position of women in the Vedic period, position of women in the medieval period, position of women in the British period. Women's movement in the colonial period, social reform movement, nationalist movement. Women's movement in the post-colonial period, Telangana movement, Chipko movement, anti-Iraq movement. Women's movement in India since the 1970s. Summary. Learning objectives are, after going through this unit, you will be able to aware about the position Indian women as mentioned in the scriptures and learn about the position of women in the colonial and post-colonial periods through the movements. Introduction part. The beginning of women's movement can be observed first from the social reform movement in the 19th century. During the colonial period, women's movements in India were born out of the same historical circumstances and social milieu as earlier 19th century social reform movements, which provoked a new thinking about various social institutions, practices, and social reform legislations. The women's movement's ideological and social content changed from time to time and continued into our lives and our times. The movement in its entirety can be divided into three distinct phases. First phase is social reform movement, national movement, and social reform legislation in the colonial period. Phase 2, women's movement in the post-colonial period. Phase 3, women's movement in India since 1970s. Patriarchy, caste system, and several other social and religious ideas and practices which have originated in the ancient Indian social milieu continue to dominate our anthropological thinking about the social status and position of Indian women and are still relevant issues, and therefore when one discusses them a historical overview is a necessity. Position of women in India society has been patriarchal for most part of the recorded history. It is difficult to talk about the position and status of women with all women being categorized as uniform. There has been infinite variation on the status of women depending on the culture, caste, class, family, structure, and property rights. Even while women have right to kinship systems, the entire mechanism of marriage, descent, residence, and inheritance are rarely organized in such a way as to guarantee women access to resources or to allow them to secure access for other women. In fact, under patriarchal order, kinship, conjugal, and familial systems tend to construct women in such a way that they hardly live as independent beings and they are seen only in relation to man, thus depriving women of their selfhood and agency. Pandey 2010. Hence, for a proper understanding of the social reform movements for the development of women in India, it is necessary to examine the historical background that necessitated and brought about social reforms. In Indian history, we see major shifts in the position of women in different periods, and some of these changes are reflected in the text that prescribe codes of behavior and therefore capture the dominant worldview of the period. Position of women in the Vedic period. The role and status of women throughout ancient and medieval period has been far from static, ranging from one of authority to freedom to one of subservience. Most of the historical sources by and large refer to the elite section of society, concentrating on the court and the aristocracy, and hence when they talk of women they generally refer to women of this class because women from other classes and tribal backgrounds had different norms. Tribal women and women from the laboring caste and classes are rarely visible as they represent those groups which did not have a literary culture and therefore did not leave behind much evidence. However, there are references to them in literature, and historians also use archaeological evidence to try and reconstruct the lives of the pre-literate societies. It is generally accepted that one of the bases of the stratification in society is the economic surplus that is appropriated by a ruling class, and in the context of the hunter gatherers, we see that such a surplus is not there, and there the question of private property does not assume much significance as these societies were relatively egalitarian. It is with the rise of sedentary settlements that we see the emergence of stratification as the existence of a class of non-food producers who lived on the labor of others is seen. In the Indian context, a large number of Neolithic settlements are noticed in the northwestern parts of India. The rise of Indus Valley civilization based on urban settlements and long distance trade was excavated a century ago. However, in the absence of any written record and the undeciphered nature of the Indus seals, we are unable to proceed any further and therefore unable to reconstruct the position of women. Though it has often been stated that the position of women was much better in the Vedic period and things started deteriorating with the coming of the Muslims, and the often quoted examples are given of Gargi and Maitre, who participated in the Sabha and Samitis, it cannot be denied that ancient societies were patriarchal on the simple count that the predominant structure and values of society were oriented to giving men a superordinate status, a fact that was reinforced by sacred literature. In fact, one can see continuity in modern times, which is one of the reasons that the social reformers and freedom fighters took up the agenda of women's movement in the post independent period as one of the unfinished businesses of Indian social reform. Many accounts were written about women in the 19th century by the European travelers. The Orientalists reconstructed the glory of Indian civilization in the past. The past was presented as a homogeneous whole without any aberration. The effort was to make the natives understanding their laws and appreciate the efforts made by their rulers. The colonial restructuring of gender and the circular institutionalization of literature both worked to undermine the authority of Indian literature and the societies that gave rise to them, though they retrieved and put into circulation many Sanskrit and Persian texts. It was a highly restructured version of the past that emerged in the Orientalist framework. Tharu et al. 1991. All these texts showed that women had a very high status in the Vedic period, which was a golden age, and then the status of women declined with the coming of Muslim rule, and now it was for the British to improve the status of women. One also sees a change in ancient India during the transition from the early to the later Vedic period, when the pastoral and semi-nomadic society of the early Vedic period, with its relative equality, gets settled during the later Vedic period, and the territorial units are established during this period. Another perceptible change is seen during the Upanishadic period and later during the 6th century BC, with a proliferation of urban settlements. The emergence of the Gharya and the Srota Sutras offer us a glimpse of the position of the woman during this period. The emergence of the Griha and the Srota Sutras offers us a glimpse of the position of the woman during this period. Agriculture was established along with craft specialization in the urban centers, and the Grahapati or the householder seen as the ideal. He was the one who exercised control over the household. We get a clear indication of the growing control of the household over the women of the household and their dependence on the men. Many of these scholars depended for their sources on textual materials which are Brahminical in origin. These texts are heavily preoccupied with religious and legal questions, women are viewed mainly in the context of the family, the relationship between husband and wife being the main backdrop. The first millennium BC can be called the era of the founding of Brahminic patriarchy, and the 19th century colonial period saw the reconstruction of Brahmanic patriarchy as part of a larger scale construction of Hinduism. Chakravarti 1998. Buddhist texts are at a considerable distance from this ideal, along with the Jaina and other heterodox religious traditions. Though the Buddha and Mahavira spoke for equality of women, we also notice some resistance from members of the Sangha. As has been pointed out, most of the historical sources of the earlier period generally refer to elite groups, the king, the court, and the rich merchants. We have to infer about other sections of society from indirect references. The women of aristocracy were regarded as gentle creatures, the mothers of future rulers. Marriage was frequently a disguise for a political alliance, and for those of lesser standing, a means of mobility for the family. The aristocratic woman led a well protected and isolated life. Reference to women from respectable homes moving about wield goes back to early centuries AD, and the Parda of Islam intensified the seclusion of women. Thapa 1975. The women of the artisan families and those of the peasants had a less relaxed life. Here the pressure was not so much from social modes as from the needs of economic survival, where leisure was limited and women participated in the professional works of men. Perhaps the most independent among the peasant women were those who had distinct economic roles, where they had individual access to local markets. There are ample references to such women in the Smriti literature like the Manusmriti, the Smritis of the Apastamba and Gautamba. Apastamba or Gautama. In addition, the Jataka stories or Jatak Katha also offer us many glimpses from the lives of these women drawn from royalty, aristocracy, trading, artisanal, hunting, fisher folk, and laborers. What clearly emerges from reading these sources and the Sanskrit literature and dramas and inscriptions is a distinction between different classes of the women, where royal women needed protection and the subaltern women were more unfettered. This distinction can be seen in the realm of religion also, with Lakshmi and Parvati being demure while Kali and Durga being ferocious. According to ancient and later Brahminical law books, for a woman her dharma was Stri dharma. Her dharma was Stri dharma, and her notion of dharma was not a self definition but a worldview thrust on her with predominantly male interest. Due to their supposedly fickle nature and the inherent pollution in the female body, women were seen as being subordinate to the voice of authority in the family and had to engage in frequent acts of ritual purifications. They had to visit temples with great regularity, perform sacred rites with higher faith, and submit to religious fast. At the same time, we have examples of women who composed many hymns of the Rig Veda. Apala, Lopamudra, Gargi, Maitreyi, Ghosha were few of the women philosophers. There were groups of women who studied throughout their lives and were known as Brahmavadinis. Women also attended political assemblies and offered sacrifices along with their husbands. Thank you very much.